The underground parking garage of Halston Enterprises was always quiet in the early hours of the morning. The low hum of fluorescent lights echoed off concrete walls, and the distant thud of car doors closing was the only sound that reminded the space was alive. It was Monday, gray skies and a biting chill hung over the city, but inside the company's headquarters, the week had just begun. Employees, wrapped in coats and clutching coffee cups, moved briskly across the lot, each in their own hurried world. At the far end of the garage, a black luxury sedan gleamed beneath a fluorescent bulb. Its surface reflected the gray concrete pillars, the painted arrows on the floor, and the steady approach of the company's most important figure, Daniel Whitaker, CEO of Halston Enterprises. His polished shoes clicked rhythmically against the cement, a sound that seemed louder than it should have been in the stillness. Daniel, tall and composed, moved with the steady grace of a man who commanded both respect and authority. He had just returned from a red-eye flight the night before, yet his posture betrayed no weariness. In his hand he carried a sleek leather briefcase, the kind executives used not just for files, but as symbols of status. His security detail trailed behind him, two suited men with discreet earpieces and the silent alertness of bodyguards who had memorized every shadow in the building. And then it happened. "Don't get in the car." The voice split the air like a crack of thunder. It was deep, raw, and filled with urgency. Every head in the garage turned. The echo carried across the concrete walls, hanging in the silence that followed. Daniel stopped mid-step, his hand just inches from the door handle of the sedan. His security men reacted instantly, moving in front of him like shields, their hands brushing near their belts. A secretary halfway across the lot dropped her coffee, the paper cup rolling across the floor as brown liquid spread in a thin stream. Conversations froze, footsteps halted, and the world seemed suspended for a moment. The man who had shouted stood in the shadow of a nearby pillar. A push broom leaned against his shoulder, and a cart of cleaning supplies rested beside him. Henry Lewis, the company janitor. For years, Henry had been an invisible presence in Halston Enterprises. He was there before sunrise and long after sunset, quietly mopping floors, emptying bins, polishing glass doors until they shone like mirrors. Most employees barely noticed him. Some didn't know his name. He was simply the janitor, the man in a navy jumpsuit with dark, work-worn hands and a face lined with quiet endurance. But now, Henry's eyes were alive with intensity. His voice, usually soft, carried the authority of a command no one could ignore. He stepped forward into the light, his hand raised not in threat but in warning. Daniel studied him carefully. "What did you say?" His tone was calm, but his eyes narrowed, sharp and assessing. Henry's chest rose and fell as he pointed toward the car. "Don't get in," he repeated firmly, every word weighted with certainty. The security detail bristled. One of them hissed into his microphone, calling for backup. Another stepped toward Henry, suspicion in his eyes. But Daniel held up a hand, stopping them. For reasons he couldn't yet explain, he wanted to hear the man out. The employees gathered near the elevator whispered among themselves. "What's going on? Did he just yell at the CEO? Is he crazy?" Their voices bounced off the walls in hushed disbelief. Henry, however, didn't flinch beneath the growing stares. His gaze remained locked on the sedan, as though he saw something others didn't. His fingers twitched slightly at his sides, a man caught between the instinct to act and the fear of overstepping every line of authority in the company. "Mr. Whitaker," he said, his voice quieter now but steady. "Something's wrong with that car." For a long moment, the parking lot was filled only with the buzz of the lights above and the nervous shifting of feet. Daniel's security team exchanged glances. To them, Henry's warning was nonsense. He was a janitor, what could he possibly know? But Daniel was not so quick to dismiss. He had built his empire on instincts, on listening when others ignored, on pausing when others rushed forward. And now, standing in that sterile garage, something about Henry's urgency pricked at his own intuition. He studied Henry's face. This was not the wild cry of a man seeking attention. It was the voice of someone certain, someone who had seen danger before. Daniel lowered his briefcase slowly and stepped back. "All right," he said, his tone calm but commanding. "No one touches the car." A ripple of shock passed through the onlookers. The CEO had listened. He had stopped. The security men hesitated, unsure whether to argue or obey. Finally, with tight nods, they moved cautiously toward the vehicle. One crouched to examine the undercarriage. Another scanned the seams of the doors with a small flashlight. Their movements were sharp, deliberate, the air thick with tension. Henry stood rooted, his jaw clenched, his eyes never leaving the sedan. His breath was shallow, but there was no regret in his posture. If he was wrong, he knew his job, and perhaps his dignity, would vanish by morning. But if he was right... From across the garage, the secretary who had spilled her coffee clasped her hands to her mouth, unable to look away. Every employee felt it, something extraordinary was unfolding, something they would remember for years. Seconds ticked by. The silence was unbearable. And then, one of the guards froze. His flashlight beam landed on something beneath the driver's seat, something metallic, something wired. "Sir," the guard said sharply, his voice breaking the stillness. "We've got a device." The word sent shockwaves through the garage. Gasps erupted, people stepped back instinctively, and fear rippled through the crowd like a sudden storm. Daniel's eyes flicked to Henry. The janitor's expression didn't change. He had known. Somehow, he had known. What had begun as an ordinary Monday morning had transformed into a moment no one in Halston Enterprises would ever forget. The janitor had yelled. The CEO had listened. And in that choice, hesitation instead of arrogance, everything had shifted. Daniel straightened his shoulders, his gaze sweeping over the stunned crowd. For the first time in years, the powerful CEO realized that sometimes salvation comes not from the boardroom, not from the corner office, but from the quiet voice that dares to speak when no one else will. And Henry Lewis, the janitor no one noticed, had just altered the destiny of Halston Enterprises with 4 simple words. "Don't get in the car." The moment the guard uttered the words, "We've got a device," the garage transformed from tense silence into chaotic motion. Gasps spread like wildfire. Some employees instinctively ducked, others scrambled back toward the elevators, clutching bags and briefcases as though paper and leather might shield them from the unknown. The air filled with frantic whispers, the scrape of heels against cement, and the rising pitch of fear. Daniel Whitaker, however, did not move. He stood as if anchored, his sharp eyes locked on the black sedan that had nearly become his coffin. Around him, his bodyguards drew closer, hands hovering near weapons, scanning for threats. But it was not the faceless danger outside the company walls that now gnawed at them, it was the sudden realization that danger had been sitting right under their noses. "Get everyone out of the garage," Daniel ordered, his voice even, commanding. He didn't need to shout, the authority in his tone carried across the panic. His men sprang into action, ushering workers toward the elevators and stairwells with clipped commands. Within minutes, the echoes of rushing footsteps faded, leaving behind only the CEO, his guards, a handful of stunned onlookers, and Henry Lewis, the janitor who had changed everything. Henry stood a few paces away, hands at his sides, his expression unreadable. The broom that leaned against the pillar behind him looked strangely symbolic now, a weapon of ordinary life, belonging to a man who had just averted extraordinary catastrophe. One of the guards rounded on Henry. "How did you know?" The question snapped like an accusation. His hand hovered close to his firearm, eyes narrowed with suspicion. Nobody just spots a device like that from 20 feet away. Henry met the man's stare without flinching. "I didn't see it. I felt it." The guard sneered. "You felt it?" The police arrived within minutes, sirens echoing faintly from the street above before cutting off in the garage ramp. Officers swarmed in, their boots pounding on the cement, voices crackling through radios as bomb technicians prepared to secure the device. The black sedan was cordoned off with yellow tape, a grotesque centerpiece in a scene of flashing lights and hard stares. Detective Karen Holt, a sharp-eyed woman with a reputation for cutting through deception like glass, stepped into the circle. Her trench coat swayed as she moved, her eyes flicking from Daniel to the car, then to Henry. "Mr. Whitaker," she greeted briskly. "We'll need statements from everyone here. And I suggest you stay upstairs until we've swept the entire building." Daniel nodded but pointed toward Henry. "Start with him." The detective turned her gaze on the janitor, her expression unreadable. "You saw something?" Henry's voice carried the same quiet gravity as before. "Not saw. Noticed. Details don't lie if you know how to read them." Detective Holt raised an eyebrow, her curiosity piqued. "And how do you know how to read them?" Henry hesitated again, but the weight of the moment pressed honesty out of him. "I used to be EOD. Explosive Ordnance Disposal." He paused, eyes distant for a flicker of a second. "Afghanistan. Iraq. I know what danger looks like." The detective's face softened, just slightly. She scribbled in her notebook, the scratch of pen on paper loud in the hush. Meanwhile, the guards shifted uncomfortably, their earlier suspicion tempered by a grudging respect. They had doubted him, but his credentials spoke louder than their prejudice. Daniel, however, said nothing. He simply studied Henry, filing every revelation into the quiet vault of his mind. Still, unease threaded through the garage like smoke. Because the question wasn't just how Henry had known. The real question was why the bomb was there in the first place. When the bomb squad finally wheeled the device away, secured in a steel case, the garage felt colder, emptier. Detective Holt snapped her notebook shut. This wasn't random. Whoever did this had access. Knowledge of your routines, Mr. Whitaker. This was meant for you, specifically. The words hit harder than any explosion. Daniel's men stiffened. The implication was clear, someone inside the company wanted the CEO dead. Suspicion slithered through the air. Every employee who had been in the garage earlier suddenly became a potential suspect. Every familiar face upstairs now wore the invisible mask of possibility. And in that uncertainty, paranoia took root. Daniel finally turned to Henry again. His voice was quiet, but it carried across the space with undeniable weight. "You saved my life." Henry didn't respond immediately. He simply nodded, his eyes downcast, as though uncomfortable with the attention. But not everyone was ready to crown him a hero. In the shadows of the garage, whispers would soon twist the narrative. To some, Henry was the savior. To others, he was too convenient, too precise. After years of invisibility, his sudden prominence drew both admiration and suspicion. By the time the last of the flashing lights vanished from the garage, the story was already mutating upstairs. Executives speculated over their lattes, assistants gossiped in the hallways. The janitor had shouted. The CEO had stopped. A bomb had been found. And no one knew who to trust anymore. In his office overlooking the city skyline, Daniel Whitaker stared out the window, his reflection pale against the glass. For all his wealth, all his power, he had never felt so exposed. Somewhere within his empire, betrayal had taken root. And the man who had dragged it into the light was Henry Lewis, a janitor with a soldier's past, a warning voice no one had expected to hear. The company was shaken. The board would demand answers. The police would dig deep. But Daniel knew one thing with a clarity sharper than glass. The bomb had failed. But the real explosion had just begun. By the next morning, the story had already spread like wildfire across Halston Enterprises. Executives whispered in glass-walled offices, assistants passed rumors in break rooms, and security teams doubled their patrols. Everyone had an opinion. Some called Henry Lewis a hero. Others muttered that no janitor should have been able to predict danger with such precision unless he was involved. Henry ignored the stares. He had lived long enough to know that the truth was rarely seen at first glance. As he pushed his mop bucket across the marble lobby, his weathered hands gripping the handle, he seemed every inch the invisible man again. But inside, memories churned, memories he had buried under years of silence. That night, when most of the company had gone home and the building lay in shadow, Henry sat in the small janitor's room tucked behind the maintenance hall. The room was no bigger than a storage closet, the walls lined with shelves of cleaning supplies. But tucked inside Henry's battered locker was a box he hadn't opened in years. He slid it onto his lap, his fingers brushing across the lid. For a long moment, he just stared, as if opening it might release ghosts he'd spent a lifetime trying to cage. Finally, he lifted it. Inside were fragments of a different life. A faded military patch with the letters EOD stitched in bold. A photograph of a younger Henry, lean and sharp-eyed, standing in desert fatigues beside a group of men who all wore the same hardened expression. A medal dulled by time, the ribbon frayed at the edges. Beneath it all, folded neatly, was a letter from the Department of Defense, his discharge papers. Henry leaned back against the chair, the air heavy in his lungs. The memories came like shards of glass, sharp and sudden. He was 23 when he first joined the army. Explosive ordnance disposal wasn't the path most men chose willingly. It was dangerous, thankless work. But Henry had always been the kind of man who couldn't walk away from responsibility. If something threatened others, he had to confront it. Fear wasn't an excuse, it was a tool to sharpen instincts. He remembered the desert heat pressing against his skin, the weight of the bomb suit that turned every movement into a struggle. He remembered the silence that fell over a convoy when a suspicious object was spotted on the road. And he remembered the eyes of his unit, waiting for him to decide whether to cut the red wire or the blue, whether to declare the path safe or doomed. Those choices carved him. Each successful disarm was a heartbeat stolen back from death. Each failure, well, failure wasn't an option. Not for him. But war had a way of breaking even the strongest. Henry had seen men he laughed with over rations reduced to silence forever. He had watched friends disappear in dust and fire. And when his tour ended, when the government sent him home with a pat on the back and a folded flag for losses no one would ever truly count, Henry discovered something cruel. The world outside had no place for men like him. He drifted. A few odd jobs. Security work here and there. But eventually, he found himself in the quiet anonymity of janitorial work at Halston Enterprises. It was steady, invisible, and safe. No one asked questions. No one looked at him long enough to see the man he used to be. That anonymity suited him, until yesterday, when he opened his mouth and shattered the silence of years. Now everyone was looking. A knock on the door pulled him back from his thoughts. Henry quickly shoved the box back into his locker and snapped it shut. The door creaked open. Standing there was Daniel Whitaker. The CEO looked different outside the spotlight of boardrooms and shareholder meetings. His tie was loosened, his sleeves rolled up, but his eyes still carried the same sharp intensity as the morning before. "Mr. Lewis," Daniel said, stepping inside. His voice was calm, but there was a weight to it. "We need to talk." Henry stood slowly. "About yesterday?" "About you," Daniel replied. The silence stretched before Daniel continued. "You saw something no one else did. You saved my life. But the truth is, I don't believe in coincidences. I believe in patterns. In reasons. You weren't just lucky." "Who are you, Henry?" Henry hesitated. He could lie, dismiss it, keep the past buried. But the look in Daniel's eyes, calm, piercing, reminded him of the commanders he once served under. Men who already knew the truth before they asked the question. "I was Army," Henry admitted. "EOD. Explosive Ordnance Disposal." Daniel's eyebrows flicked up slightly, but he didn't look surprised. If anything, he looked as though he had already guessed. "And now you mop floors?" Henry's jaw tightened. "It's honest work." Daniel studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "It is. But don't mistake invisibility for irrelevance. You've been hiding, Mr. Lewis. Yesterday, you stepped out of the shadows. And now the whole company knows it." Henry shifted uncomfortably. "I didn't do it for attention. I did it because," he stopped himself, searching for the right words. "Because danger smells the same no matter where you find it. I couldn't just stand by." Daniel's eyes softened for a flicker of a second. He saw something familiar in Henry: duty, sacrifice, the burden of leadership. Perhaps that was why he had trusted him so quickly the day before. But then the CEO's gaze hardened again. "The police believe this was an inside job. Which means someone in my company planted that device. Someone I've trusted." He stepped closer. "You've seen betrayal before, haven't you, Henry? In war. In life. I need men like you now more than ever. Men who see what others miss." The words sank deep. Henry wasn't sure if it was an offer, a plea, or a command. But it carried weight. "I'm just a janitor," Henry said quietly. "No," Daniel replied firmly. "Yesterday proved you're much more than that." For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, two men from very different worlds bound together by a single act. Finally, Daniel turned toward the door. "Tomorrow morning, you'll meet with Detective Holt and my security chief. I want your eyes on this case. Whoever tried to kill me is still out there, and they won't stop until they succeed." Henry's chest tightened. He had spent years trying to escape that world, the world of danger, suspicion, and hidden enemies. But fate had dragged him back. As Daniel left, Henry sat heavily on the chair, staring at the closed locker. His hands trembled slightly, but not from fear. From recognition. The past he had tried to bury wasn't gone. It had simply been waiting for the moment he would need it again. And now, whether he liked it or not, Henry Lewis was no longer invisible. A clipped tone leaned forward. Which narrows it to employees above a certain clearance level. Executives. Security personnel. IT staff. His eyes scanned the room, sharp and unyielding. The executives bristled. "Are you suggesting one of us tried to kill our own CEO?" snapped Leonard Drake, the chief financial officer. His voice was strained, defensive. "I'm not suggesting anything," Marcus replied coldly. "I'm stating facts." The room crackled with unspoken accusations. Daniel raised a hand, silencing the bickering. His gaze swept across the faces of men and women he had trusted for years. Some looked guilty, others insulted, all of them unsettled. Until we know more, every possibility stays on the table. At the far end of the room, unnoticed until that moment, sat Henry Lewis. Dressed in his plain navy work shirt, he looked out of place among the suits and silk ties. Yet his presence carried weight after yesterday's events. He hadn't asked to be here, but Daniel insisted. Detective Holt turned to him. "Mr. Lewis, you were the first to notice something was wrong. From your perspective, did you see anyone unusual in the garage before the incident?" Henry shifted in his seat, uncomfortable under so many stares. "No one unusual," he said slowly. "But unusual doesn't always mean suspicious. Sometimes it's the things that look ordinary that stand out if you pay attention." "What do you mean?" Holt pressed. Henry leaned forward, his rough hands clasped. "I've walked that garage every day for years. I know the cars. I know the sounds. Yesterday, there was a van parked 2 spaces from Mr. Whitaker's sedan. White panel van, no markings. That wasn't there last week. Might be nothing. Might be everything." The detective scribbled furiously in her notebook, eyes narrowing. Marcus Vance looked impressed despite himself. Daniel studied Henry with quiet intensity. The janitor spoke not with theory, but with the precision of a man who lived and breathed observation. "Find." A clipped tone leaned forward. "Which narrows it to employees above a certain clearance level. Executives. Security personnel. IT staff." His eyes scanned the room, sharp and unyielding. The executives bristled. "Are you suggesting one of us tried to kill our own CEO?" snapped Leonard Drake, the chief financial officer. His voice was strained, defensive. "I'm not suggesting anything," Marcus replied coldly. "I'm stating facts." The room crackled with unspoken accusations. Daniel raised a hand, silencing the bickering. His gaze swept across the faces of men and women he had trusted for years. Some looked guilty, others insulted, all of them unsettled. Until we know more, every possibility stays on the table. At the far end of the room, unnoticed until that moment, sat Henry Lewis. Dressed in his plain navy work shirt, he looked out of place among the suits and silk ties. Yet his presence carried weight after yesterday's events. He hadn't asked to be here, but Daniel insisted. Detective Holt turned to him. "Mr. Lewis, you were the first to notice something was wrong. From your perspective, did you see anyone unusual in the garage before the incident? Henry shifted in his seat, uncomfortable under so many stares. No one unusual, he said slowly. But unusual doesn't always mean suspicious. Sometimes it's the things that look ordinary that stand out if you pay attention. What do you mean? Holt pressed. Henry leaned forward, his rough hands clasped. I've walked that garage every day for years. I know the cars. I know the sounds. Yesterday, there was a van parked 2 spaces from Mr. Whitaker's sedan. White panel van, no markings. That wasn't there last week. Might be nothing. Might be everything. The detective scribbled furiously in her notebook, eyes narrowing. Marcus Vance looked impressed despite himself. Daniel studied Henry with quiet intensity. The janitor spoke not with theory, but with the precision of a man who lived and breathed observation. Find that van, Holt ordered one of her officers. Run plates, ownership, everything. The room fell into a tense silence again, broken only by the sound of pens scratching paper. Outside the boardroom's glass walls, employees hovered like shadows, desperate for rumors. When the meeting adjourned, Daniel caught up with Henry in the corridor. You didn't have to speak up in there, he said quietly. Henry shrugged. You asked me to be here. If I see something, I say it. That's all. Daniel smiled faintly. That's more than most people do. They walked together toward the elevators. The CEO's polished shoes clicked against the marble, while Henry's scuffed work boots made a dull thud. Side by side, they looked like men from different worlds, yet fate had tied them together. As the day wore on, suspicion spread like an infection. In the cafeteria, employees eyed one another with nervous distrust. Conversations cut off whenever someone new entered the room. Long-standing friendships bent under the weight of doubt. The company, once a hive of ambition and efficiency, now felt like a labyrinth of paranoia. Henry moved through it quietly, mop in hand, ears open. People underestimated the invisible man. They spoke freely when he was near, forgetting he was there at all. And in those murmured conversations, he began to piece together threads of unease. A secretary mentioning how the security cameras glitched the night before. A technician complaining about someone accessing the server room without logging it. An executive's assistant whispering that her boss had left unusually early the day the bomb was planted. He carried these fragments silently, unsure what to do with them. For years, his job was to sweep away messes others left behind. Now he was standing in the middle of one too large for any broom to fix. Late that evening, Henry found himself outside again, standing at the edge of the cordoned-off garage. The space was eerily quiet, stripped of cars, lit only by the cold glow of floodlights. He crouched down, running a calloused hand across the concrete floor where Daniel's car had stood. A voice broke the silence. You're not supposed to be down here. Henry straightened. It was Detective Holt. She approached with her notebook tucked under one arm, her expression unreadable. You're not exactly following protocol, she said. Henry met her gaze. I never did. The detective studied him for a long moment. You're not what you seem, Mr. Lewis. Most men in your position would have faded back into the shadows by now. But you keep stepping forward. I don't want to, Henry said simply. But trouble doesn't care what you want. It finds you anyway. For the first time, Detective Holt allowed herself a faint smile. Then let's hope your instincts keep finding the right kind of trouble. As she walked away, Henry remained staring at the empty parking space. The bomb had been disarmed, the car removed, the danger averted, for now. But the true threat was still out there, hidden among familiar faces. And Henry knew, with a sinking certainty, that this was only the beginning. By midweek, Halston Enterprises no longer felt like the gleaming corporate empire it once was. The polished marble floors and towering glass walls now reflected nothing but unease. The bomb in the garage had been removed, but the shadow of what almost happened still clung to every corner of the building. Productivity plummeted. Meetings devolved into whispers. And everywhere Henry Lewis walked, eyes followed him. Some were wide with gratitude. Others narrowed with suspicion. The cafeteria, usually alive with chatter, had turned into a theater of paranoia. Employees sat in tight clusters, their conversations hushed but intense. "They say the janitor knew before anyone else," one whispered. "Maybe he's in on it," another countered. "Don't be ridiculous, he saved Mr. Whitaker's life." The debate circled endlessly, splitting the company into camps, those who saw Henry as a hero, and those who saw him as something darker. Henry himself ate alone, hunched at a corner table with a tray of overcooked pasta and a carton of milk. He had grown used to invisibility. But invisibility had its comforts. No one expected anything from you. Now, every glance carried weight. Every whisper sounded like a verdict. He heard the rumors. They moved through the air like smoke. He was military. He's dangerous. He's looking for attention. He set it up himself. He tried to push the words away, but even the strongest man feels the sting of suspicion. Meanwhile, upstairs on the top floor, the board of directors gathered in a tense emergency session. Daniel Whitaker sat at the head of the table, his jaw set, his eyes sharp. The boardroom buzzed with accusations, theories, and demands. "We cannot operate under this kind of fear," Leonard Drake, the CFO, declared. "Our stock dropped 3 points yesterday. Investors want answers. They want assurance. And what assurance do you suggest we give them?" Daniel replied coolly. "That we've magically rooted out a traitor without evidence? That the danger is gone when it isn't? This entire company could collapse under scandal," another board member snapped. "We need to contain the narrative before it destroys us." Detective Holt sat quietly at the far end of the table, scribbling notes, her sharp eyes observing the panic unravel. Finally, she spoke. "Containment is impossible. The press already caught wind of the investigation. There will be stories by morning. Your only choice is whether you face it head-on or let speculation bury you." Her words hit hard. The board members shifted uneasily, but Daniel remained calm. He had weathered storms before. This one was different, yes, but storms were where he thrived. Still, even he could not ignore the growing whisper that their unlikely savior, Henry Lewis, might also be their greatest question mark. "Mr. Whitaker," one board member said pointedly, "how well do you really know this man? A janitor suddenly turns into a bomb expert? It's too convenient." Daniel's gaze cut across the table like a blade. "I know enough. He saved my life." "But if he didn't," the CFO pressed. "If this was staged to earn trust, he is now closer to you than anyone else. That makes him more dangerous than the bomb itself." For the first time, Daniel allowed silence to stretch before he answered. His voice, when it came, was low and unshakable. "I built this company on trust and instincts. Mine told me to listen to Henry. And until I'm proven wrong, I will stand by him. The debate ended there, not because the board was convinced, but because they knew better than to challenge Daniel Whitaker twice in one meeting. Downstairs, Henry continued his routine. Mop, sweep, empty bins. He moved quietly through the building, though he could feel the shifting atmosphere. People stopped mid-sentence when he entered a room. Assistants glanced nervously before slipping away. Even security guards, once dismissive, now regarded him with wary respect. Late in the afternoon, while polishing a brass railing in the lobby, Henry noticed two junior employees whispering by the elevator. He couldn't hear every word, but fragments reached him. They're saying he planted it himself. Too suspicious. Henry gripped the rag tighter, his knuckles whitening. He had faced insurgents with rifles, disarmed bombs with his bare hands, but gossip, malicious, baseless gossip, was a battlefield of its own. He could walk away from danger, but how do you walk away when the enemy is perception itself? As evening fell, Daniel found Henry in the empty lobby. The janitor bent over his work cart. Rough day? Daniel asked. Henry glanced up, his face guarded. You don't need me telling you what you already know. The company's rattled. People don't work when they're afraid. Daniel nodded. Fear is poison. It spreads faster than fire. He studied Henry for a long moment. And right now, you're in the center of it. Some see you as their shield. Others, their threat. That's a dangerous place to be. I didn't ask to be in it, Henry muttered. No, Daniel agreed. But you're in it all the same. And you'll have to choose how to stand. Before Henry could respond, Detective Holt entered the lobby, her heels clicking against the marble. She held a thin folder in her hand. We tracked the van you mentioned, she said without preamble. Her tone was clipped, her eyes sharp. Rented under a false name. The ID was fake, but the trail led back to someone with access to company systems. IT department. Daniel's jaw tightened. An insider. Exactly, Holt confirmed. Which means the threat is very real, and very close. Henry exhaled slowly. The company's paranoia wasn't misplaced after all. There was a traitor in their midst. That night, as the building emptied, Halston Enterprises felt more like a crime scene than a workplace. Security checkpoints were doubled, cameras rechecked, employee badges scanned twice. The hum of printers and chatter of late-night workers were gone, replaced by the heavy silence of suspicion. Henry lingered longer than usual, his mop set aside as he leaned against the janitor's cart. He watched shadows stretch across the lobby and felt the weight of eyes, both real and imagined, pressing against him. For years, he had been invisible. Now, he was a symbol, and symbols are never safe. Upstairs, Daniel looked out his office window at the city skyline, lit by 1,000 lights. He thought about loyalty, about betrayal, about the thin line between trust and danger. And downstairs, Henry thought about the same things, only his version came with scars, medals, and ghosts he could never forget. The bomb had failed. But the company itself was now detonating from within. And Henry Lewis, the janitor who had shouted 4 words that saved a life, stood at the epicenter of a storm that was only beginning. The following morning dawned cold and gray, as if the city itself mirrored the unease inside Halston Enterprises. By the time employees streamed through the revolving doors, police were already stationed in the lobby, their presence both reassuring and unnerving. Each worker swiped their ID badge with trembling hands, glancing nervously at the officers as though afraid their own secrets might spill into the open. Detective Karen Holt set up camp in a glass conference room on the third floor. Her desk was a sea of files, laptop screens, and half-empty cups of black coffee. She moved with relentless focus, her eyes sharp as she pieced together the fragments of the case. Every hour brought new evidence, new threads leading deeper into the labyrinth of betrayal. Daniel Whitaker stood near the window, watching the city traffic crawl below. His reflection looked pale and tired in the glass, but his posture was rigid, commanding. Across the table sat Henry Lewis, the unlikely man at the center of it all. He looked out of place in his navy work shirt, yet his eyes carried the gravity of someone who had seen danger before. Detective Holt began without ceremony. We traced the van back to a server access point. Whoever rented it used credentials that matched your IT department. She flipped open a file, her pen tapping against the page. Specifically, an employee named Victor Ramos. Mid-level systems analyst. No prior record. Clean performance reports. On paper, he's forgettable. But his login was used to disable cameras in the garage the night before the bomb was planted. Daniel's jaw tightened. And where is Mr. Ramos now? Missing, Holt replied. Didn't show up for work yesterday. His apartment's empty. Neighbors say he left late at night with a suitcase. Disappeared. The room fell silent. The implications were clear. An inside man had not only attempted murder but had vanished before being caught. Henry leaned forward, his rough hands clasped. Ramos didn't do this alone. A mid-level analyst doesn't suddenly turn into a bomb maker. Someone else guided him. Detective Holt studied him. What makes you say that? Pattern, Henry answered simply. I've seen it before. In Iraq, insurgents recruited locals who knew the roads, the routines, the weaknesses. But they were pawns. The real architect stayed in the shadows. Ramos is a pawn. Holt scribbled in her notebook. She had come to expect Henry's observations, unpolished but precise. Daniel's gaze lingered on Henry. If he's a pawn, then the real question is, who's pulling the strings? That question hung heavy in the air. As the investigation deepened, paranoia inside Halston Enterprises reached new heights. Executives eyed one another with undisguised mistrust. Employees whispered in elevators, speculating which of their leaders might be hiding dark motives. Even Marcus Vance, the head of security, wasn't immune to suspicion. Some whispered that the attack had been too sophisticated to happen without a lapse, or complicity, on his part. Henry felt the weight of those whispers every time he pushed his mop down the halls. For years, he had been invisible. Now, he was seen too much, a figure caught between reverence and resentment. Yet he kept listening, gathering scraps of conversation, piecing together the puzzle in his quiet way. One evening, while emptying trash bins near the IT department, Henry overheard two technicians whispering. Ramos was broke, one muttered. Maxed out credit cards, overdue bills. Someone must have offered him money. Henry paused, his hand frozen over the trash bag. Money. Desperation. Leverage. He filed the detail away. Later that night, Daniel summoned Henry to his office. The room glowed with the soft light of a desk lamp, the city's skyline a sea of glittering lights beyond the glass wall. Daniel leaned back in his chair, his hands steepled. I want you to tell me something, Henry, he said quietly. Why did you notice what no one else did that morning? Why you? Henry shifted, uncomfortable under the question. Because danger has a smell. A rhythm. Once you've seen it enough, you don't forget it. I didn't think, I just knew. Daniel nodded slowly. And now? What do you know about this company? Henry hesitated, then spoke with careful honesty. You're under attack from the inside. Someone close. Ramos was bait. Whoever's behind this wanted you dead, yes, but more than that, they wanted chaos. Fear. Division. He paused. And they're getting it. The CEO's face darkened. He had seen the panic ripple through his empire, productivity halved, trust shattered, whispers of stock collapse spreading like rot. Whoever had orchestrated this wasn't just after his life, they were after the very heart of his company. Detective Holt entered then, a folder tucked under her arm. We pulled financial records, she announced. Ramos received deposits into a secret account, large sums, funneled through shell companies. Traced back, guess where it leads? She dropped the folder on the desk. Daniel opened it, his eyes narrowing at the name printed in black ink. Leonard Drake. Chief Financial Officer. Daniel's head snapped up. Leonard? His voice was sharp, incredulous. Holt's tone was clipped. The deposits tied back to accounts managed by him. Could be coincidence, could be framing. But the money trail is there. Henry's expression hardened. It's not coincidence. CFOs don't move money without reason. And if he's behind it, he had access to everything, schedules, codes, funds. Daniel's jaw clenched, torn between betrayal and disbelief. Leonard had been with him for 15 years, through mergers, crises, and triumphs. Could the man who helped build Halston Enterprises now be trying to burn it down? The revelation spread through the company by dawn. Executives whispered behind closed doors, their shock barely contained. Leonard Drake avoided questions, barricading himself in his office. But suspicion was a shadow that could not be locked out. In the cafeteria, employees leaned over their trays. The CFO, one whispered. It's always the money men. By late afternoon, Detective Holt confronted Leonard directly, escorted by officers. His protests echoed down the hall as he was led away for questioning. This is a mistake. I would never, Daniel, you know me. His voice cracked, half fury, half desperation. From a distance, Henry watched, his eyes unreadable. He had seen this before, men who looked steady as stone until the cracks revealed the truth beneath. Whether Leonard was guilty or being set up, the damage was already done. That evening, Daniel and Henry sat in the quiet of the CEO's office, the city skyline glowing beyond. Daniel's face was lined with fatigue. If Leonard is guilty, then I've been blind for years. If he's innocent, then someone is 10 steps ahead of us. Either way, my company is bleeding trust. Henry leaned forward. Then you need to stop thinking like a CEO. Daniel arched an eyebrow. And start thinking like what? Henry's voice was steady. Like a soldier at war. Because that's what this is. The truth had been uncovered, but with it came more danger. Leonard Drake might be guilty, or he might be a pawn like Ramos. Either way, the real mastermind was still out there, watching as panic spread, waiting for the perfect moment to strike again. And Henry Lewis, once invisible, knew he was standing on the battlefield once more. The boardroom was heavy with silence. Not the usual kind, the respectful quiet that came before presentations or quarterly reports. No, this silence was brittle, charged, a silence that spoke of fractures running deep beneath the surface. Daniel Whitaker sat at the head of the long oak table, his eyes fixed on the city skyline beyond the tall glass windows. He wasn't looking at the streets, not really. He was looking inward, weighing decisions that would alter not just his own life, but the fate of Halston Enterprises. The board members sat stiffly, their faces etched with unease. The arrest of Leonard Drake, the company's CFO, had shaken them to the core. For years, Leonard had been Daniel's right hand in financial strategy, the architect of many of their most profitable ventures. And now? He was in a police interrogation room, accused of funneling money to fund a plot to kill the very man he had served. Marcus Vance, head of security, stood at Daniel's side, his broad frame a wall of discipline. Detective Holt sat a few chairs down, flipping through her notes, her pen tapping against the folder. And in the far corner, as though he'd been placed there on purpose, sat Henry Lewis. The janitor who had shouted. The soldier who had seen too much. The man whose instincts had forced open the cracks in a polished empire. Mr. Whitaker, one of the board members finally said, his voice tight, the company is hemorrhaging trust. Shareholders are calling me every hour. The press is painting us as a corporation rotting from within. This has to stop. Daniel turned, his gaze sharp. You think I don't know that? The boardroom was heavy with silence. Not the usual kind, the respectful quiet that came before presentations or quarterly reports. No, this silence was brittle, charged, a silence that spoke of fractures running deep beneath the surface. Daniel Whitaker sat at the head of the long oak table, his eyes fixed on the city skyline beyond the tall glass windows. He wasn't looking at the streets, not really. He was looking inward, weighing decisions that would alter not just his own life, but the fate of Halston Enterprises. The board members sat stiffly, their faces etched with unease. The arrest of Leonard Drake, the company's CFO, had shaken them to the core. For years, Leonard had been Daniel's right hand in financial strategy, the architect of many of their most profitable ventures. And now? He was in a police interrogation room, accused of funneling money to fund a plot to kill the very man he had served. Marcus Vance, head of security, stood at Daniel's side, his broad frame a wall of discipline. Detective Holt sat a few chairs down, flipping through her notes, her pen tapping against the folder. And in the far corner, as though he'd been placed there on purpose, sat Henry Lewis. The janitor who had shouted. The soldier who had seen too much. The man whose instincts had forced open the cracks in a polished empire. Mr. Whitaker, one of the board members finally said, his voice tight, the company is hemorrhaging trust. Shareholders are calling me every hour. The press is painting us as a corporation rotting from within. This has to stop. Daniel turned, his gaze sharp. You think I don't know that? Another director leaned forward. Then take control. Distance yourself from this, janitor. Do you understand how it looks? Your entire survival, our entire survival, resting on the word of a man with no title, no stake, no accountability. All eyes slid to Henry. He sat quietly, his hands clasped, his gaze lowered. He had heard this before, in different forms. In war zones, men without medals were questioned even when their instincts saved lives. Recognition always came after the fact, if it came at all. Detective Holt cleared her throat. For what it's worth, Henry's instincts have been dead on since day one. Without him, we'd be standing over a casket right now. Instincts don't run companies, the CFO's interim replacement snapped. Logic does. Numbers do. Strategy does. And trust, Daniel added quietly. The room stilled at the weight of his tone. Daniel rose from his chair, his tall frame casting long shadows across the polished floor. He looked around at each of them in turn, men and women who had been his allies, his rivals, his confidants. I built Halston Enterprises on trust. Trust between me and my board. Me and my employees. Me and the market. If that trust has rotted, it's because we stopped listening to the voices we didn't want to hear. He turned then, his gaze falling on Henry. Yesterday, that voice came from a man none of you noticed. A man most of you still don't see. The board members shifted uncomfortably. Daniel continued, his voice steady, firm. Henry Lewis saved my life. Not because of luck. Not because of coincidence. Because he saw what others didn't. And I intend to trust him, not just with my life, but with the safety of this company. Murmurs erupted, protests rising like a wave. Absurd. He's unqualified. You'll destroy us. Daniel raised his hand, silencing them. This isn't a democracy. I am CEO. And my decision is final. He turned to Henry. Effective immediately, you will serve as my personal advisor on internal security. Not janitorial staff. Not invisible. You answer directly to me. Henry stiffened in his chair. His mouth opened as if to protest, but no words came. For years, he had blended into shadows, content to be overlooked. And now, with a few words, Daniel had thrust him into the center of the storm. The board erupted again, voices clashing, some furious, some stunned. But Daniel ignored them. He had made his choice. After the meeting broke, Daniel lingered in the boardroom with Henry. The city lights glittered in the glass behind them, the world outside oblivious to the storm raging inside. You didn't have to do that, Henry said quietly. Yes, I did, Daniel replied. His voice carried both gratitude and resolve. This company is bleeding. I need people who see the truth, not just what's convenient. You've already proven you can do that. Henry shook his head. I clean floors, Mr. Whitaker. I'm not built for boardrooms. Daniel stepped closer. You're built for survival. For seeing danger when no one else can. That's worth more than every suit in this building combined. Henry looked away, conflicted. He thought of the ghosts in his locker, the medals, the patches, the faces of men long gone. He had walked away from that life once, choosing silence over scars. But silence had dragged him back, whether he wanted it or not. You're putting a target on me, Henry muttered. You already had one, Daniel said. At least now you won't be standing alone. Just then, Detective Holt entered, her expression sharp. She held up a file. We've finished the first round of forensics. The device used parts that don't match Ramos's skill set. He wasn't the bomb maker. Which means someone else, someone still inside, built it. Henry's stomach sank. He had known it, but hearing it aloud was confirmation. Ramos was a pawn. Leonard Drake might have been one, too. Which meant the real enemy was still moving in the shadows, unseen, waiting. Daniel exhaled, his eyes hardening. Then we keep digging. And this time, we don't stop until we burn out the rot completely. That night, Henry walked the halls of Halston Enterprises, mop cart abandoned, eyes scanning every detail. The whispers were louder now, the janitor turned advisor, but he no longer cared. He had been invisible once. Now, he was a weapon. In the silence of the empty corridors, Henry realized the truth of what Daniel had said. He wasn't just cleaning floors anymore. He was cleaning something much darker, the corruption festering inside these walls. And somewhere in the shadows of the company, the real mastermind was watching, waiting, calculating the next move. The decision had been made. The war inside Halston Enterprises had only just begun. The storm broke on a Thursday. For days, Halston Enterprises had operated in a fog of tension, every corridor heavy with suspicion, every boardroom a battlefield of glances. Leonard Drake remained in custody, still shouting his innocence, while Victor Ramos had vanished without a trace. Detective Holt's team worked around the clock, pulling threads, tracing accounts, following shadows. But shadows have a way of slipping through fingers. Until Henry Lewis noticed something no one else had. It was late evening when Henry walked through the executive wing, the halls hushed and dim. He moved slowly, his boots echoing faintly, his eyes catching the little details most ignored. A trash bin overflowing with shredded papers. A door left ajar. A faint hum of servers through a vent. Then he saw it, Marcus Vance, the head of security, slipping into the server room. Odd, Henry thought. Vance had been there often lately, too often. Always late at night, always alone. Henry's instincts whispered again, that quiet pull in his chest that had saved lives before. He followed, moving silently down the hall. Inside the server room, he saw Vance hunched over a console, his broad shoulders tense, his hands moving quickly across the keyboard. Henry caught a glimpse of the screen, encrypted files, rerouted signals, logs being wiped clean. It hit him like a cold slap. Marcus Vance wasn't protecting the company. He was dismantling its defenses from within. Henry stepped forward, his voice low but firm. "You're cleaning up the wrong mess, Marcus." Vance spun around, his face caught in the glow of the monitor. For a moment, his mask slipped, the calm professionalism replaced by raw, cornered fury. "You should have stayed invisible, janitor." The words dripped with venom. Before Henry could respond, Vance lunged. The two men crashed against the metal racks, the server lights flickering as the struggle rattled the room. Vance was stronger, trained, but Henry had fought men like him before. He ducked a punch, drove his shoulder into Vance's chest, and sent them both sprawling across the floor. Their fight was brutal, silent except for grunts and the clang of metal. Vance reached for a hidden knife strapped to his ankle, but Henry's boot pinned his wrist. Years of disarming explosives had honed Henry's reflexes, he knew how to neutralize threats fast. With a sharp twist, he sent the blade skidding across the floor. The door burst open. Daniel Whitaker stood with Detective Holt and two officers behind him. They froze at the sight, Henry holding Vance pinned against the server rack, sweat dripping down both men's faces. "Get him off me!" Vance shouted, but his voice cracked, desperation seeping through. Holt's sharp eyes scanned the room, then the console. The files half erased, the rerouted signals. She didn't need more proof. "Cuff him." The officers swarmed, hauling Vance to his feet and locking his wrists in steel. His fury erupted in a stream of curses, his polished facade gone. "You think you've won? You don't know who you're dealing with. This company, this empire, it should have been mine." Daniel's expression was cold steel. "You betrayed everything. Everything we built. Vance spat on the floor as they dragged him out. His footsteps echoed down the hall until silence returned, heavy and final. Henry leaned against the console, catching his breath. His knuckles were bruised, his shirt damp with sweat, but his eyes were clear. The truth had been dragged into the light. Detective Holt approached, her voice even. "You just exposed the real traitor. Without you, he would have erased every trace." Henry shrugged. "I just followed the mess." Daniel stepped closer, his gaze intense. For a long moment, he said nothing, only studying the man who had once been invisible. Finally, he spoke. "You've done more than follow. You've saved lives. Twice now. And you've saved this company." Henry shifted uncomfortably, unused to praise. "I did what anyone would do." "No," Daniel said firmly. "Most people look away. You looked closer. That makes all the difference." By morning, the news had spread across Halston Enterprises. Marcus Vance, the trusted head of security, had been arrested as the true mastermind behind the assassination attempt. Leonard Drake was cleared, though the stain of suspicion would never fully wash away. Victor Ramos remained missing, but without his handler, he was a shadow with no direction. The company reeled, but slowly, trust began to rebuild. Employees, once fractured by fear, now found themselves united, not by corporate slogans, but by the story of a janitor who had refused to stay silent. At the next all-staff meeting, Daniel stood at the podium, his voice strong, clear. The auditorium was packed, the air charged with anticipation. "4 days ago, this company faced betrayal," he began. "We faced danger from within. But we also found something greater than betrayal, courage." He turned, gesturing toward the side of the stage. "Henry Lewis." The room erupted into applause as Henry stepped forward, awkward in the spotlight. His work shirt was pressed, but his hands were still calloused, his posture still humble. He looked out at the sea of faces, faces that had once overlooked him, and felt the weight of recognition for the first time. Daniel continued. "Henry is more than a janitor. He is a soldier, a protector, a man who saw what no one else could. He reminded us that value doesn't come from titles or offices, but from integrity and courage. From this day forward, Henry Lewis is not only head of security for Halston Enterprises, he is proof that every voice, no matter how small, matters." The applause grew thunderous. Some employees stood, clapping until their palms stung. Henry shifted uncomfortably, but a faint smile tugged at his lips. For years, he had walked these halls unseen. Now, he stood in the center, not as an invisible man, but as a symbol. After the meeting, as the crowd dispersed, Daniel approached him quietly. "You've earned their respect. And mine." Henry looked at him, his voice quiet but steady. "Respect isn't what I was looking for. I just didn't want to stand by when I could act." Daniel nodded. "And that's exactly why you've earned it." Later that night, Henry returned to his small janitor's room. The battered box still sat in his locker. He opened it again, patches, medals, photographs. But this time, the ghosts felt lighter. Not gone, but less suffocating. He placed the medal back inside, shut the lid, and locked it. Then he looked at his reflection in the scratched mirror above the sink. For the first time in years, he didn't see a man hiding. He saw a man standing tall, carrying both his past and his present. The company had been saved, trust had been restored, and the true enemy had been unmasked. But more importantly, Henry Lewis had found something he never expected, a place where his voice mattered. He was no longer invisible. He was respected.